Firstly, I'd just like to welcome everyone and thank you very much for joining our International Architecture webinar today, Sustainable Education and Sustainable Environments. My name is Joshua Bomford and I'm a Student Recruitment Officer here at the University of Tasmania, and I'll be your host. Before we introduce our presenters today, may I please remind you of some of the housekeeping. If you have any questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat and we'll address them after the presentation. And just to make the audience aware as well, we will be having this session recorded, so it will be available for later viewing, and we'll be able to provide you with a link to that as well. And once again, thank you for attending. Thank you for taking your time to attend this webinar. Over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Joshua. I will share my screen. Some of the most used words in the last couple of years. Here we go. Hopefully you can all see that. Before we started, I'd like to take the opportunity to give an acknowledgement of country. Today, I'm speaking on Lutruwita Aboriginal land. I'd like to acknowledge with deep respect the traditional owners of this land, the Palawa people. The Palawa people belong to the oldest continuing culture in the world. They cared for and protected country for thousands of years. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to the many Aboriginal people that did not make elder status. I pay my respects to the Aboriginal community that continues to care for country. I recognise a history of truth that acknowledges the impacts of invasion and colonisation that resulted in the genocide and forcible removal of Aboriginal people from their lands, and stand for a future that profoundly acknowledges Aboriginal perspectives, culture, language, and history. Thanks for that. Let's move on to the opening slide. As Josh said, my name is Andrew Steen, Dr. Andrew Steen. I'm the coordinator of the undergraduate program here at the University of Tasmania, the Bachelor of Architecture and Built Environments.
Hi, and I'm Dr. Helen Norrie. I'm the coordinator of the Master of Architecture program. And today, what Andrew and I are going to talk about is some of the really amazing, interesting projects that we've been doing at UTAS. A lot of you are probably quite familiar with the program here. And a lot of what we do is very community-based, it's place-based. And our program is really structured around a very interesting process called learning by making, where the students are not just designing things on paper or in digital forms, but they're actually building things, building structures, experiments, and a range of different scales of buildings. We're also going to then talk about how we've been able to adapt that project, which has been traditionally incredibly hands-on, how we've been able to adapt it during 2020 and beyond to deal with the fact that a lot of us have been in isolation and a lot of people are working remotely. So if we go to the next slide, Andrew. Tasmania is really small. There's about 500,000 people, and we're in Launceston, which is the second city in the north of the state. Hobart in the south, which is the capital, has about just over 200,000. Launceston has around 100,000. And one of the things that's fantastic about living in places of this scale is the really direct connection with community. And so a lot of the work that we do is very much a unique type of work, integrated learning, where the students are doing speculative projects, but they're often based on real world issues and connecting directly with the community. Next slide. In Tasmania, we have an amazing organisation called MONA, the Museum of Old and New Art, and they have a series of festivals that happen in both summer and winter. And one of the projects that we've been able to do for them over the last couple of years is this beautiful project, which Andrew's going to talk about in more detail. So MONA also has a festival of music and art called MONA FOMA. And then what we were asked to do was actually to build a temporary stage that could be relocated all around the state that became a backdrop for performance. So the stage packs up into a shipping container. It's a retrofitted shipping container and is able to be put on the truck and relocated. So spaces of all different types from all around the state can actually get converted into shipping, into performance spaces. And I'll hand over to Andrew now, and he can tell you a little bit more about the way that that project worked.
Yeah, well, this is a kind of example of its extended use, I guess. Harvest Market is a farmers market that's held every weekend. It's really a popular event. If you don't see someone at Harvest Market on a Saturday, you could probably catch them at Bunnings. But apart from that, everybody's there basically. So here it is at Harvest Market, and previous photo was at Harvest Market too. But the its launch was at the Monofoma Festival. Monofoma Soma is the name of the work. Soma stood for a bunch of acronyms, Step on Board, Make Art being one of them. Something other than mediocre architecture was another. So it was the result of a series of works, a bunch of units, and lots of hard work by students. And this is the kind of end result here, seeing a local harpist inside the space at a lunchtime performance. These lunchtime performances were held right in the middle of the city. That beautiful brutalist building in the background is Henty House. And that used to function as a kind of a social services building. So the work that we produced was placed right within the middle of the city and engaged with a bunch of different stakeholders during the festival. The festival itself looked to occupy the spaces of the city. Here's another picture here, and in this we see Yan Ng on the drums that I can't remember the name of, but also Brian Ritchie, and he's playing the shakuhachi. Now, Brian Ritchie will be a feature in the next several slides. So I'll talk a little bit more about him later, but you can see there's just a huge breadth of performances that were staged in Soma during.
Andrew, I think the point to make in this slide is that the whole thing packed out, and this is in extended mode, isn't it? So in this, you can see that the floor is actually built out beyond the limits of the container, and the beams across the top are expanding the whole thing out, so that rather than just being a very shallow container, it becomes a deeper container that the taiko drums can sit in, because they don't want to get wet, and it also changes the acoustic quality of the space. So the whole idea of it is, depending on how it's set up, it can be compacted or expanded out depending on the uses for the type of music and the location that it's sitting in.
Yeah, taiko, thank you for that. That's right, it was designed to exist in or be able to be used in different configurations. Here's Brian again in a different mode, playing in a surfer rock band. So the acoustics inside the space were described very complimentarily. Some of the performers used to refer to it during the festival as an ego box, because they didn't sound, they sounded their best producing their music within that space. So that's the end result of that project. But I thought it would be worthwhile to take you all back through the kind of genesis of the project and through the development of it. So Monofoma Soma began when Brian Ritchie and the other curators and organizers of the Monofoma Festival approached us to help them move the festival from Hobart to Launceston. So it's a discrete project, the box, but the project is embedded in a much broader project about bringing culture to the northern half of the state. So it's contributing to really big ideas, even though it's a small box. So Brian Ritchie, the festival curator, he's probably, or he might be better known to some of you at least, as the bass player in the Violent Femmes, which was a band that existed in the 1980s to 2000s, I guess. Blister in the Sun being their biggest hit. So the Soma box is the end product. It's a mobile stage, but the beginning was here in one of our studios. It involved me organizing a studio with second and third year, this was just second year students that culminated, or in a workshop that investigated acoustics in the city and performance spaces in the city. That workshop was called COMA, to rhyme with monophoma, and that COMA referred to or stood for City of Music and Art. And this studio was lucky enough to have a couple of visits from Brian and the other festival organizers. He spoke directly to the students before they started work. He addressed their work during, and he spoke to their work after. So it's it was a really authentic dialogue that we established with Brian and Lee, who was the other organizer of monophoma in that stage. So armed with this kind of stimulus, we invaded the city, used all its kind of leftover spaces, started to think about where a festival could be held throughout the city. We improvised along the way. I had to make sure I got permissions from all of the councils to perform in different spaces. And we moved through the city with performers organized by monophoma, and started to understand how different spaces sounded and how people responded to performances in different spaces. Here we are testing in different locations. The one on the left is a more common location for busking. The one on the right is just a kind of back alley that only cars go down generally. So we really investigated with an open idea of what could make a good space for a performance. The city too, I think, gained from this experience. It caused life to happen in the city. It was strange for a lot of locals to see this happening, and people were kind of stimulated by the actions of the school and the work of the students.
And the students got to have a chance to understand the way the acoustics of the space worked, but also how people might gather in the space while they're watching things as well too, didn't they, Andrew?
That's right. Yep, absolutely. Here's another shot of one of these site testing activities. You can see we started to integrate different technology here. That the student in the yellow raincoat is holding an omnidirectional microphone that could be used to play back the sound and give an idea of what the sound sounded like in that space. So not just a kind of clean understanding of the sound production, but the sound in the space itself. So after all those investigations, we went back into the studio, and you can see here Brian in the middle with the pork pie hat, and Lee's with the flat cap just behind him. This is some of the work of the students and those special guest collaborators, and they really were collaborators. They were really involved throughout the whole process and at the most fundamental of levels. They were there to give feedback on the work. They went around to each group's work, spoke to it, had dialogues with the students, tried to understand what they were doing in some cases, and everybody was really enriched by this kind of dynamic interplay. They were essentially played the role of the clients. So as Helen said, it's a real case of work integrated learning. Following COMA, the production of SOMA began. This is a different unit, a learning by making specific unit. The previous unit was a design unit with learning by making components, but this is a specific learning by making unit. And you can see a couple of our students here talking to a model, a scale model that they made during the process. And again, this presentation was to the clients, and they were real clients in this particular stage of the process because they had funded, that supplied the shipping container and had funded some of the expenses to cover the materials. So this learning by making unit had about 20 second and third year students. They started from scratch, just the idea that there'd be a shipping container and there was a whole heap of functions that the Monophoma crew wanted to have it serve, and they had to develop their design from that.
And many of the students in this studio had done the workshop with the musicians in the previous semester, hadn't they? So you had a whole lot of expert knowledge that was actually brought to bear, but then other students from other cohorts who came together in the project as well. Yeah,
it was a large proportion, over 3/4, just followed straight through from the design studio into the learning by making unit. So this is the kind of result. It's a 2-week intensive. This was the result of the first week, and after the clients gave positive feedback, the next week was spent fabricating the fit out, getting on the tools, and making the scale model a reality at 1-to-1 scale. It's the learning by making tradition we have at UTAS it's almost 40 years old. It requires students to do things with their hands and learn through applied work, and learn practical skills that will help them design logical, workable, and cost-effective buildings. So the timber that you can see lining the shipping container was not quite given, but given at a really great price from a local supplier. But it needed a lot of treatment to get to be in the state that it could get used. So they processed all of that timber in the fabrication process.
Just on that quickly, Andrew, one of the first questions that we've had come through today was what happens with some of the materials after events like this, and how do they get used?
Well, this one is the perfect example of continuing use. So we made the soma for Monophoma. It featured in 2 festivals, and then it was bought and I should say, as part of those festivals, it was used at harvest markets.
Yep.
But subsequently, it was bought by harvest markets, and it is a permanent fixture in that market now. So it has changed owners. Its use has been the same, but it's changed owners. So it's continuing to do exactly what it was designed to do. Yep.
And every Saturday morning in Launceston, you can go down and there'll be a different type of performance that's happening out of this. So most of the projects that we do are generally done as permanent things. If we do experimental projects, they're actually much less frequent actually doing experimental things. So it's not as if the materials are going to waste.
Yep, that's a pretty good segue into the next project. This happened at the end of the learning by making unit. This kind of initial testing from Brian and Jan in the workshop. But in speaking of more experimental projects, the success of SOMA and the great relationship that we established with Monophoma team led to a sequel, essentially, called BLOMA. That's not an acronym. It just relates to the fact that it's an inflatable. So it's an inflatable that's made out of Tyvek. So it's the Tyvek is not reusable, but in terms of the amount of material for the scale of the project, it's pretty hard to beat. So here you can see this inflatable. On the right, you can see the fan and the kind of pipe that push the air pressure into the inflatable, and the inflatable was established over this device that was used to record people's secrets and messages onto a cloud-based repository. That project, that's its final install in the festival on the right. It's in the workshop on the left with one of our colleagues, Cridwin Owen, trialing out the recording feature. But again, this was the result of a 2-week intensive that involved scale model, design development, and one-to-one fabrication, and also allowed the students to visit fabricators and other consultants that are local to us here. Here we are in the local steel fabricator, watching the steel get laser cut, and before that it was bent. Yeah. Oh, something going on here. Sorry about that. There's Brian in the workshop during Bloma, with me talking to him, and here's a full type prototyping. Here's another one that we didn't use at the festival, but you can see the kind of scale of these things are consistent. You can see in this on the table down the bottom there, the scale model as well. This is the workshop environment that we do a lot of our work in.
Andrew, I think there might be a question in the background. Josh, could people the voice activated? So could Panwadi ask a question?
Let's just have a quick look. Yeah, Panwadi, you're now on. You're now able to talk if you would like to. If you have a question.
Yeah, I just want to know that do you have any minimum requirement in regarding to the student? You have to, like, the student have to provide any portfolio regarding to get into the course?
You can answer for undergrad.
Yes. So it depends. It depends on the student and what they've done. I assess a lot of students who are trying to get recognized prior learning or credit, and a lot of study that they've done in different institutions contributes to their acceptance in and progression through the course. I assess what they have. I assess what they have done in terms of the units and the description, but also look to portfolios to try to assess how far they've progressed and to see whether they are suitable for some credit.
So I mean, like, the portfolio is also is a part of the criteria that you consider whether the student can get into the faculty to the course or not. Yeah. So without the portfolio, they cannot get in.
No, if you're going direct entry into first year, it's grades based, so you don't need a portfolio. It's only if you're trying to get recognised prior learning or
yeah,
credit.
yes, all right. Okay, that's it.
The master's program, you do need to have a minimum of equivalent of a credit grade in your undergraduate degree. The degree has to have been from a course that we acknowledge is, so that then you also provide a portfolio, which is a way that we can actually assess the quality of the course that you've been in for masters. Yeah, so there's 3 different options: straight into first year, recognised prior learning into second year, or into masters.
Okay, so at the moment, are you starting to conduct the class in the room environment, or they have to study from home at the moment?
We're back on campus in Tasmania, and we started this semester in a restricted mode, but the second semester will be completely back to normal, fingers crossed, if nothing else happens. But we've still got a number of students who are remote, so we're going to end up the presentation by showing you some of the things about that, and we can explain that more at the end, how that's working. We might just roll on through, Andrew, unless if Rajiv's question is directly related to the things we're looking at, then maybe we'll answer that question now. Otherwise, we'll jump to the end. So, Rajiv, do you want to ask the question later on, or does it relate specifically to some of these projects? We might keep. So Andrew, just keep rolling through and we'll come back because I think there's some questions that are specifically related.
Sure. So we wanted next to talk about another type of learning way making project. It's called Species Hotel. It's been running a few years. It involves essentially constructing habitats, microhabitats for species that are vulnerable along the Midlands. It involves collaboration with councils and with conservation groups in Tasmania, and also interdisciplinary collaborations with other scientists. This is the work in one of the buildings that we currently occupy. Here's the work on site. So again, it's one of these projects that we like to think that we're actually making a real difference in this project. It's not about human communities, but rather animal communities.
So it's a part of the Midlands, which is a big farming area in the middle of Tasmania, where a lot of the natural habitat has actually been taken away for farming land. And so these, what we call species hotels, have been designed so that a really broad range of animals are able to nest in them. So what it's about doing is actually changing the nature of the habitat and for the wildlife. And we work directly with a number of different scientists from a range of different, like bird specialists and mammal specialists, to understand the kinds of habitats that people might need. So whilst the structures actually look quite random, they are designed to be things that birds can nest in and little marsupials can nest in, so that in a really open landscape that has no undergrowth, it gives places for the animals to hide. And these buildings all these things are just made mostly out of timber, with the idea being that it'll actually just start to deteriorate over time.
So here's the point that we're starting to transition into discussing the sustainability of the course in terms of potential online collaboration or ways of engaging in this kind of practice, this work integrated practice without being hands-on. So Clarence City Council is a neighbour to Hobart City Council. It's down the south of the island, and they approached us to essentially construct a version of SOMA that was in their mind, a kind of shipping container conversion. But they approached us last year, and clearly the passage of last year did not really allow for, even down here we were really lucky with the pandemic situation, but even down here it was not business as usual by any stretch. So instead of progressing down the same path as Mona, FOMA, COMA and SOMA, we had to reconceptualize what students could, how students could engage with a project of this nature, with specific community-based clients and with a kind of cultural hands-on agendas. So we took the ideas and the kind of philosophies of learning by making and moved it closer into the work integrated learning and advanced research areas. So I led a bunch of students who each looked at individual aspects of what the container could provide. You can see assembly, mobility. Up the top, there's acoustics and spatial configurations and so on. So all of the students addressed these practical real world considerations individually and largely from the comfort of their own home. And the idea was that we could put these things together into some sort of a dynamic complex. Eventually, we proposed a kind of a game in which the container was kind of rebuilt every time it was installed. So the people who, the projection was the people who were involved in that use could use this game to facilitate a restructuring of the space that suited their particular event. And the research largely desktop based, but it spanned a whole series of conventional and less conventional references. And by doing this research, we started to get better informed, and subsequently the container project has moved into the fabrication phase. So hopefully, if you come back in a year or so, you might see the completed Clarence City Council container, or CCCC, as I like to call it.
Another example of community engaged projects that we've been able to do remotely is one of the really big issues for all of us in the world is about food systems and how food systems are part of the health of places, but also they really affect the physical structure of spaces. So at UTAS, there's a growing food systems innovation group that's interested in food equity, making sure that people have access to food, and also food literacy, so that people actually understand what parts of food they get nutrients from and what are the implications of the different food that they eat in terms of, if you're buying avocados from Argentina, that's probably not the best thing to do. So one of the projects we did in Masters of Architecture through our Advanced Design research team is selective, where we have groups of 6 students work on an intensive project, is that we had a student in China and we had a whole bunch of students in Australia. And we were just looking more broadly at food culture and how understanding of food cultures can actually help us to understand the way that we need to structure the city to make the most of that. So there was a lot of really broad research that the students looked at about the way that media defines how we eat. We had a student who was really interested in mukbang and the way that people are making these crazy videos of people eating food really quickly, right down to really practical things like understanding food supply chains. And particularly during COVID, supply chains became incredibly complex in lots of places, and particularly for Tasmania because it's an island. So getting the architecture students to understand things that aren't just buildings, but they're actually bigger, broader things about cultural conditions that affect the way that we live is a really important part of what the program is. And so if we go on to the next slide, so then the students take these research projects like the one that Andrew just explained for Clarence, and also the food systems project, and then they develop them up into their final capstone project, where each of the students take the theme that they've been studying in the research studios and they develop projects for them. So this was a project by one of the students who comes from Devonport up in the north, and she did a speculative project for how there could be a farmer's market and a community garden embedded into that community, built over a series of stages. So a lot of the research that we're doing that can seem like it's not specifically about architecture then actually gets presented back out as architectural speculative projects. And we're just going to end up on the final slide then with explaining some of the things that Panwadi was talking, we were talking with Panwadi about. So we've had students remote, and obviously at the beginning of last year, Australia closed the border to China. But more than that, Tasmania, as we say, we've got a moat. There's a big heap of water and we lifted up the drawbridge. So Tasmania was disconnected from the rest of Australia for a lot of the year. And what we've really found, I think everyone has found, all of the tools like Zoom and a range of other tools have been fantastic. So traditionally our end of year presentations are this very conventional method where the students have these big printed out drawings and they present to them. But the slide on the left, you can actually see the way that we were able to, down the bottom is Lin Ping in China, and she's presenting her project to the room full of students, as you can see on the right. So Lin Ping is sitting down the bottom here, and then her presentation was actually presented on the slides here, and the final slide is all of her panels, which for most students was actually beside. And then at the end of the session, this is one of the remote reviewers who's actually in Brisbane tuning in and talking. So we've been able to use these systems to work really well, and we're doing what we call Zoom in the room, where everyone who's on campus is also on Zoom. So they come in with their laptops, and so that if you're remote, it doesn't feel like there's a room full of people that you're not in, but you feel like you're joined together. And we've found this to be really fantastic. And the image behind Andrew and I is the Architecture and Design building, which is currently having upgrades to it. And as part of that process, there's going to be a whole layer of new tech that will be added into the building, which has got, will have screens and microphones and speakers that will allow us to continue to do this. And what we've found has been fantastic is that we've been able to bring our alumni in from all around the world and all around Australia to actually drop into professional studies and to a range of other things. So at the moment, and until the borders open, we've been able to continue to have students we've got students in Africa and in China, Singapore, all around the place who've been able to come and join in and feel like they're part of the campus, which has been really fantastic. So that's kind of the main parts of the things that we've got to talk about. And so we're happy to go into questions. I can see that Rui has got a question in the chat saying that UTAS is great with sustainable building and architecture from sustainable materials in Tasmania, but how can this be applied to international students who return to countries like Singapore? I think the main thing is that the basic principles of things to do with sustainability are the same everywhere. And one of the bottom ones is loose fit, long life, and I can never remember the third one, but the basic principles of the fact that you are always thinking about the long-term view is really important. I think that sustainability is an even bigger issue, is as big, if not bigger, in Singapore, because you've got a very finite piece of land resource. So it's not just the materials, it's also how you make the most with what you've got that becomes really important. So I think that the specifics of the materials that might be available in Australia is one thing, but the principles of what actually constitutes sustainability in buildings and materials are pretty much global. And once you know the principles of those things, you can then ask questions that are locally specific.
Yeah, that's right. And just to add, there's the material question or the material concern, but as we were speaking to in this presentation, there's also the social and community-based things. So all of those things are at work in a complex, and Helen's right, the philosophy remains the same. It's just about understanding what you can do relative to your situation.
Yeah, we've got another question now coming up in the chat, and feel free to put your hand up if you want to talk to us, because that's always great. We've got a question in the chat about some video on YouTube about students using VR tech during their learning. It might have been VR, but it might have also been AR, which is augmented reality. So we do have VR setups, and in the new building, we're also going to be having information communication technology will be on campus with us and being taught out of our building. And they've got a lot of amazing things like the HIT lab, which is a high-end IT lab, and there'll be a lot more collaboration between there. But probably the video that you've seen might have been augmented reality, which are these glasses, Andrew, I've forgotten the name.
HoloLens.
HoloLens glasses.
Yes,
yeah. And the HoloLens glasses are clear, unlike a VR headset. And what they do is they put you inside the drawing. So if you Google UTAS HoloLens, you'll find the example of this. And so what we've been able to do, for example, we've done experiments with bricklaying, where rather than doing very complicated setouts, what the lens does is it projects on in front of you the drawing of how the building needs to be set out. So it's augmented reality, and it gives you the instructions. So it looks very strange when you see the video, because you wonder what people are doing and how they're doing things, but it's the fact that the drawing is projected onto the screens. We also have a lot of tech equipment. We've got 3D printers and laser cutters, and a 5-axis router that can actually cut things in this dimension, but also undercut. And the other thing we've got is a robot. So we're doing a lot of stuff with incremental sheet metal forming at the moment, and experiments with the Masters of Architecture studios, working out how to use the robot to assist with innovative construction technologies.
Did have another question come in from Polly.
Yeah.
As mentioned before, a student has to submit a portfolio of they want to claim a credit transfer. What's the portfolio requirement?
Well, it depends what they want to claim credit for, essentially. If they're trying to claim, there's different types of units that we run, and sometimes those units can be matched quite easily to units studied at other institutions. Sometimes the fit is less obvious, so we look for particular capacities in drawings and other work to slot them into the course at the right level. It's to no one's advantage to get too much credit, clearly, because then you're in a situation, the student's in a situation where they can't cope, but obviously we don't want anybody repeating something that they can do. So it's just about matching the student to the right level, and giving the evidence that supports me and others and Helen for the masters to make the decision where to put them.
The next, sorry, go on, Helen.
Yeah, and as part of that process, you can be asked to also provide the unit outlines for the units that you're wanting to find credit for as well, so that we can have an understanding of what the scope of things are. So really, and that's the same with the portfolio at any level of masters or whatever. What you should be doing in the folio is, it's the same for a job portfolio. You're demonstrating the range of your skills, your experience. One of the biggest problems that we find with portfolios for masters is that students can tend to want to put practice work in there because they sort of want to show that they've been working in practice. But if we can't identify the individual student's contribution in a practice, it's not very helpful. So the best advice to the students is that the folios should be, each project should be clearly labelled to say what the name of the project is, what year and what unit they did it in. So when we look at their transcript, we can see the grade that they got for the project. And it's also really helpful to write a sentence to say what was the project about and what was the thing that you were exploring. The students should also show a range of things for the master's folios that include design studios, but also technical drawings and technical skills. And if they have any other interests, like they're really great at freehand drawing, or they're a photographer, or anything else that shows their allied interest in creative fields, they're amazing model makers, make sure they show that. So really, the portfolio is the way that you get to explain the things that your transcript doesn't actually say.
And just one addition there, design work, yes, and technical work, yes. But I mean, in the undergraduate program, and Helen too, in the masters, have to look at credit for subjects that might relate to more humanities-based or reading and writing, essentially. So giving evidence to capacities in those activities is also really useful. So it might not be the traditional idea of a portfolio, like an artist coming to a workshop with a massive board and going through different pages. It's really a practical document that isolates what the person can do, so that we know where to put them.
And to include a simple one-page CV that just highlights the key things you've done. And also a lot of students do fill out the part on the application form that talks about why they want to study at UTAS. And some people just repeat the blurb that they get off the website. But what's really interesting is when students actually talk about what their motivation was, why they've studied architecture, what they're enjoying about architecture, and to also show that they have really thought about why this is a place that you want to be. It's not that useful for us to just have the students repeat back the blurb off the website. So, but the written piece of text does give us a sense of what their communication skills are, which is really key.
I might stop sharing now to get a little bit more friendly. Here we go.
Perfect. The next two questions that we did have were about the entry requirements, I think, for the undergrad program. So is there a minimum requirement for Diploma of Architectural students in Singapore to achieve to be able to enter a degree in architecture course? The next question, which is very similar, is there a minimum GPA to apply for undergrad?
To be honest, I don't know the numbers. It's a centralized process, so I don't know the details of that process. I deal with the people who have done diplomas or other courses when they're looking for credit. So I know that when I'm looking at giving credit to say someone that's finished a diploma in architecture, I can usually find some credit to give. So that obviously means that most, if not all, of the people that have done that have been accepted into the course. I don't know the details.
Very good.
Yeah, the thing is that the qualification to get into first year is less a GPA than it's more to do with the way that the systems equate what your schooling, how your schooling equates to the Tasmanian schooling. Generally at UTAS, the score is not particularly high. And at first year, the most important thing is having a minimum standard of IELTS, which is if you've come English language. So if you've come from Singapore, there's a fair chance that you're actually hitting those targets, I think. And depending, the answer to the diploma degree, it depends on which college that you've been to. Generally in Singapore, the standard of education is really great. And a lot of the colleges there are great. And so in a lot of instances, people will get direct credit of 2 years of an undergrad might give them 2 years to the other, but it's a combination of the school itself and actually how well the student has actually done in the school. That is how the assessment is made. We do pretty quick turnarounds on those, so it's worth people just putting in an application and they'll get a fairly good idea of it, particularly if they put their best self forward.
That's
and
right.
just for our agent partners that are joining us today, you can always feel free to reach out to one of the recruitment officers if you have any questions or concerns about entry requirements for the course, and we're more than happy to let you know. Yeah.
And then there's another question from Rui about, is work placement still part of architecture program? If yes, there are a lot of students taking the work program, and is there a quota? We have a work integrated learning module unit in both, one unit in the undergrad in Bachelor of Architecture, and we've got 2 units in Masters of Architecture. The work integrated learning placement is one model of work integrated learning. So technically work integrated is anything where you're really understanding the application of your study to workplace. The placement, we basically have a range of placements from architectural practices all around Tasmania to also building companies and construction companies. So there's a diversity of placements. At the moment, there isn't a quota because our student numbers aren't really high at the moment due to a slight dip from international students not being able to get here. But at the moment, again, pretty much everyone who wants to do a placement is able to. We're also looking at reaching out to our alumni, particularly in Singapore and Malaysia. We've got some incredibly great alumni there, and setting up placement opportunities for them over summer. There's already a group of our alumni who have set up at their own network, and they offer placement opportunities. And if you want to know more about that, you can contact us directly and find out about that. Yeah. Are there any more questions?
Just while we take in some last questions, I just wanted to thank both yourself, Helen, and Andrew for going through that presentation today. I think it's both, there's some very great examples there of the connection with industry and the community. I think that goes very far to say, just how connected the School of Architecture and Design is.
Mm. Yeah, and I think there were some questions. I don't know if everyone can pick up the Q&A answered questions, but while we're waiting for any other questions, there was also from the TISA India were asking about the scale of the program. I think that's one of the really big advantages in studying at UTAS as opposed to, it's one of the smaller schools in Australia. So the staff-student ratios are pretty universal across the universities. But the difference is that you're not in a year group of 500 people. So our first year cohort will be between 60 and 100. I think we've had up to 120 at one point. And we've had the most we've ever had in third year is 101, but that was a few years ago. So it means that actually having a relatively small number of students, you actually get to know your cohort really well. But it also means that the staff know you. And again, because it's quite small, we have only 12 staff, it means that we'll get to teach the same student a couple of times in the degree. And I really enjoy that because it's fantastic when you've actually taught someone in the final year of Bachelor of Architecture and then you teach them in the final year of Masters. And it's fantastic to be able to know the student's skill set, but to also see the way that they've actually developed. So it's the intimacy of the school that's fantastic. And you can see the image behind us. We also have the students can come in and work from the building. It's open from 6 in the morning till 11 at night. there's spaces that the students can actually set up. And so they develop their own community. We've got computer labs where all the software, if people can't afford the high-end software or computers with enough power, they can come and work from the building. But it's definitely also the peer-to-peer learning. And in some of the larger institutions, that's one of the things that is quite difficult when you've got multiple classes and you're in a class with one person for one subject and another person for another subject. So you really get to know your cohorts. You also get to know your seniors and your juniors. And that's a really important part of the general culture. Last year, a colleague and I went to Malaysia and Singapore as part of our kind of anniversary celebrations. And we were trying to have a small event in Singapore of about 10 people, and I think we ended up with about 45 people, because once some people realized we were coming, everyone wanted to come and catch up with us, but catch up with each other. So I think that intimacy is a really important part of it, and the connections, the really strong connections that we get with the community is part of that as well. So although it's not like living in a big city, I think for a lot of students from Asia, it's an incredibly great opportunity to live in a place that's directly connected to nature and of a scale that is an incredibly unique experience, and the students love it. I mean, it's also great to be in a different climate. It's quite cold at the moment, as you can tell by my scarf. And it's amazing how many of the students who lived their whole life in temperate climates absolutely love kind of getting out a snowball and throwing one at one another. Yeah. Just seeing if there's any more questions.
There's a question about student life compared to the mainland Australia, and I think Helen's just kind of addressed that there. There's an intimacy within the school, and there's also an intimacy within the city that we live in and Tasmania in general. It's a small scale. It's not a huge population. It's very approachable. So I think most people find that they find a niche quite easily. In terms of expenses, I think it's quite livable in that sense too. You can walk around or ride a bike, or everything's quite close. So there's no expenses that might be associated with living in a larger city on the mainland of Australia, or even more in some other location.
Yeah, the cost of living generally, I mean, the housing has been a bit complex in Tasmania over the last few years because there has been a supply issue. But the general level of rent is less than what it actually is in other places. The food can be slightly more expensive just because in Sydney and Melbourne in particular, there's lots of amazing like Chinatown and places where you can get really great cheap meals. So eating out can be more expensive, but the general, I think a lot of the students really socialize with each other, and that's one of the things you get when you've got a community, is you don't need to go out to socialize. You basically invite everyone to your house to socialize. So yeah, and just things like the fact that you're not having to pay to commute, paying a lot of money commuting. A lot of the students actually just have bicycles and ride, or they have cars and they live in shared houses where they're driving 5 minutes to come to school. So I don't think anyone drives longer than 10 minutes to come to school, basically. Yeah. How's the job market? The job market in Australia is crazy at the moment. There is so much work happening. It's partly like this time last year, everyone was really uncertain what was happening with the economy, but there is so much work happening, and that's been really it's been really kind of added to by the fact that the government has issued a whole lot of stimulus packages for housing. So every practice is constantly looking for people. And at the moment, there's just so many job opportunities. About 10 years ago, that might not have been the case, but Tasmania is really up on the rise, and there's been more and more graduates who've been able to stay here. And as the companies get bigger, they get more work, they can diversify out. So it's really interesting. But we also have an incredibly extensive alumni on the mainland and internationally. And most of the jobs a lot of the good jobs don't get advertised through Seek or any online. We've got an alumni Facebook page that's got about 1,000 members. And so all of our alumni post their job opportunities to our closed Facebook alumni group, so that our students are offering the jobs to each other before they go other places, which works quite well. Yeah. And are there scholarship options? There are scholarship options. Josh, can you talk to that a little bit more? Or?
Yeah, probably one of the most common ones that we do have is the Tasmania International Scholarship. So that's a 25% reduction in the tuition fees throughout the duration of the course. Students are required to maintain satisfactory grades in order to keep the scholarship. So that's one of the takeaways I would have. All the scholarships that we do have as well are assessed for students at the point of application. So once submitting that academic application, we'll also be able to assess you for scholarship as well.
Do the students have to apply, or they get assessed as part of the application and get offered them?
They get assessed as part of the application and offered them. We will require all of the academic documents to make the final decision on the scholarship. So if you do receive a conditional offer letter, sometimes we will require further transcripts or documents in order just to make that final assessment.
Yeah.
Yeah. But if anyone has any questions in relation to particular scholarships later on, or again, entry requirements and things like that, the course.information email that we had in the presentation, you can always send an email through and people in my team will be able to get back to you as well and just give you a bit more information and background on those questions.
Yeah, jump in, Panwadi.
Yeah, could you tell me what is the minimum GPA to qualify to get a 25% scholarship?
So it would be a comparison to, depending on where the person who studied has been at school, but it's a 75 ATAR, and it just depends on the course. So it would, it's an assessment of the student and the application overall, and then they can provide a bit more scale then. So it's really on a case-by-case basis.
And it's got to do with the ranking of the university or the college.
That's right. Yes.
So it depends. This is where it's really difficult to give direct answers to, because there's an assessment made of the ranking of the school or the college from which the students have actually attained an ATAR. But you'd have to be getting 75 as a minimum, regardless of where you've been.
Yeah, that's right.
But this is, we are talking about international student because of they maybe don't have the ATAR score like us that we have. So they maybe have a GPA, overall GPA that they got it from overseas. So then it's maybe like 3.5 GPA minimum or any signal at all. Because so then they can.
It depends, because the GPAs are all different. They're all different. They're all different percentages, whether they're 5s or 7s. And I think that the GPA, you could basically have a look at a GPA calculator, and I reckon that 3.5 is probably a bit higher than I'm just trying to Google it as we speak. So a GPA of so I think you probably need a GPA of about 2.5. Looks like it's about 8. 2.7 is about 80 on a 4 scale.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
And again, we can once we have like that information in front of us and access to our admissions office, we can make that assessment for you. But what Helen was mentioning is correct. So all different types of curriculums are against different scales. So it is very difficult to give a general overview on that just right here, that's all.
Yeah. The systems are so varied in so many different places and institutions.
Yeah. I haven't seen any other questions come in. So we got one last one.
Yeah, we also have mid-year entry into both of our programs. And that's a really important thing to remember. And at the moment, we are still taking mid-year entries and doing remote delivery. So as we've said, we've had students, we've got 3 students who've started Masters of Architecture online this semester. Someone who was the only person last year who started in first semester, and she's just about to complete her whole degree without making it here, which she's heartbroken about. But we've definitely got everything set up up so that if people, I know a lot of people last year, particularly our student in China just said, there's nothing else for me to do, so I might as well come online. So we are still doing that. At the moment, UTAS isn't offering a fee reduction to be doing things online, but what we are doing is making up for that by making sure that you're getting quite good one-on-one kind of input. So directly after this, I've got a one-on-one tutorial with a student in China. So particularly in A&D, what you're getting is a different quality of kind of input and education, which is really good. So, and I think that the other thing which is worth following up with immigration is that currently, the last I heard, and we can confirm this, is that a lot of the students are obviously wanting to study in Australia so that they can get post-graduation visas. And we need to confirm this with immigration, but at the end of last year, the story was that if you were enrolled in an on-campus course, but doing it remotely, and you had a COE and a visa, it was the government was going to be counting it as if you were here. So I don't know if that's a bit complex for people, but definitely there's that kind of vagary at the moment that I know that is putting people off coming. But it's worth keeping an eye on the current situations with the from immigration to know about that.
Yes, you correct, Helen. They don't lose the opportunity to apply for post-study work, right? I can confirm that because I'm a registered migration agent. So
yes, fantastic. So
yeah.
That was one of the things the students have been really worried about, and it's fantastic that the government has clarified that. So it does mean that even if you're not able to make it here during the degree, you've still got that advantage to be able to apply for a postgraduate graduation. And a lot of our students are realizing that they can do the Bachelor of Architecture and apply for temporary residency, and that then affects the ranking, the amount they need to pay with their international fees as well. There's a little comment here about the difference between Bachelor of Architectural Studies and Bachelor of Architecture and Built Environment. I think I'm not quite sure what the question comes from, but different universities just have different names for the same thing. So the University of Queensland, where Andrew and I went, was the Bachelor of Design Studies, that was architecture. So depending on what the Bachelor of Architectural Studies may well be exactly the same as Bachelor of Architecture and Built Environment. We used to just be the Bachelor of Built Environment. So depending on what it is, it could well be just an example of the same course with a different name.
When is the earliest that we can start applying for the courses? Well, applications for both the mid-year intake and for 2022 are currently open for international students. So yeah, please submit an application if that's what you're into.
Yeah. And what's the best way for people to ask questions directly of the school? Because is it through UConnect, or what's the best way for people to ask questions?
That email address at the presentation, that should go through to our call center team, and then we can then pass the questions on to yourselves.
Yeah.
Sorry, Joshua, how many intake there is for this course?
2, I believe. Is that
okay, all
correct?
Right.
Yeah, we
July
do.
July and February. Yeah?
That's correct.
Okay.
Previously, we only had a February intake, but both of our courses have opened up so that we have 2 intakes. And I'm not sure, Panwadi, you might have more idea, but I know that usually you have to do a 75% loading. I'm not sure how that is now affected with whether you still need to do the 75% loading if you're not on campus. Do you know about that?
I would say that it doesn't matter actually if they hold the COE, they hold the visa, and then they continue on study online. That should meet the requirement to apply for post-study work, right?
But do you have to still study a 75% load?
I need to check on that. Yeah.
I believe so.
Yeah, I believe so too. Yeah.
Yeah, great.
That seems to answer most of the questions that we've had today. Again, please send any questions that you do have later on through. And I would like to once again thank the panelists Helen and Andrew for the comprehensive presentation, and again, just answering so many of the questions that we have. But yeah, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks. That's really great to be able to connect with you all. Thanks a lot. See you.
Bye.
Bye.